Hello, everyone. I think that we can wait a minute or two and we will be starting soon. All right. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on capabilities of CloudCasa. It's your go-to solution for Kubernetes migration and replication. My name is Marcin Łukasik and I'm the host. My guests, Bob Adair, who leads product management at CloudCasa, and Martin Fan, field CTO for CloudCasa and Catalogic in North America, will surely bring a wealth of knowledge, ensuring an interesting session on your Kubernetes operations. Just a reminder, this is a Ask Me Anything webinar. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat. In the meantime, Martin, Bob, please go ahead.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction there, Martin. So hello, everyone. My name is Martin Fan, and as Martin mentioned, I'm a field CTO here with CloudCasa and Catalogic Software, and Martin and I have been doing these webinars in the past of late. Very pleased to have on another guest with me, Bob Adair. And Bob, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hey, everybody. I'm Bob Adair. I'm the, the head of product management for CloudCasa.
Great. So this will be me mostly interviewing Bob this time around instead of Martin introducing or interviewing me. And what I'd like to do is just ask you some questions on the new capabilities of CloudCasa. I know that we've recently had a new release, Bob, but for the benefit of those folks on the phone who are joining us for this Ask Me Anything webinar for the first time, I'd just like to go through a brief overview of Catalogic Software and CloudCasa. Presenting up here a slide just from our standard presentation. For those of you who don't know about Catalogic Software, we've been in business for over the past 30 years as a software development company specializing in data protection. Now we have a variety of different products that we support around this data protection landscape, such as DPX, which is our all-purpose, think traditional tape-based backups, and then as the data protection market evolved to ransomware protection, virtual tape drives, block-level incrementals, agentless backups, that is essentially DPX. And from DPX, we've also added some additional products to our portfolio. Highlighting this is our guard mode ransomware detection product. But today we're going to be focused on CloudCasa, which is our data protection for cloud native environments. As you know, if you're using Kubernetes today or hosting databases within the cloud, you realize that the method and the strategies that you would use to protect those Kubernetes clusters and cloud native databases are going to change, right? It's not as simple as installing an agent we're going to be communicating directly with cloud devices with Kubernetes clusters by installing our own agent or pod, if you will. And that is the whole purpose behind CloudCasa. Now, I also have here an architecture slide presenting our solution overview. So just let me jump to that. And what we've been doing here with CloudCasa is we've built a backup as a service for Kubernetes in Kubernetes, right? So this is essentially a Kubernetes service that we have out here running on our cloud. And you can also self-host the CloudCasa server if you want to. But essentially what CloudCasa is doing is it's reaching out into your cloud accounts, into your Kubernetes clusters, and it's protecting, looks like I clicked the wrong button there. We're protecting your Kubernetes clusters over here on the lower left-hand side by taking local snapshots and even taking copies of snapshots and migrating those copies off to our own object storage, or you even can bring your own object storage device in here. Now, there's a lot of different use cases that are available, and some of the more popular use cases that we've come across here have been users wanting to perform a backup and restore, move their clusters around, move their persistent volumes around. And that leads us into our discussion today with Bob here to talk about some of the new features of CloudCasa. So Bob, I know we had these new features come about. Why don't you tell us about what we've introduced here into our CloudCasa platform?
Hey, Martin, sure. We did another feature release of CloudCasa just a few weeks ago. I should mention that CloudCasa as a product is several years old. We came out with it in 2020, and we've had fairly frequent feature updates ever since. We do at least one major feature release per quarter, usually more than that actually. But this last release was just a few weeks ago, and the two major features that we introduced in that release were the new migration and replication job types. So you can see Martin actually has our online documentation up on the screen there. Every time we have a release, we come out with release notes, obviously, and those are all available in our online docs if you want to take a look at them. So, but as I said, the two major new features that we introduced in this last release were a migration job type and a replication job type. And as you might expect, the migration jobs are kind of a one-shot. Let's call it backup. So logically, it's like a backup plus restore, right? You can define the cluster that you want to migrate, and you can define what areas of the cluster you want to migrate. If you want to migrate the whole cluster, or if you want to migrate, just certain namespaces or certain resources, and then the target of that can be either a new cluster in the cloud that CloudCasa will create for you on the fly, or it can be an existing cluster if you just want to say migrate, one or two or 10 specific namespaces. You can send those to an existing cluster. And again, that's a one-shot job, so it's not scheduled, but you can kick it off on demand either through the UI or through the API, and it'll move your existing cluster to I'm sorry, either another existing cluster or a newly created cluster. We haven't really talked about it much yet. If you've used CloudCasa before, you probably realize this already. But one of the cool things that CloudCasa can do is it can, we have integration with the existing big three cloud providers. So that's AWS, Azure, and GCP. And you can configure CloudCasa to link to your organization's cloud accounts. And then CloudCasa has the capability to actually create a new cluster on demand. So when we back up a cloud cluster, we back up not just the data on the cluster, the resource data and the persistent volumes. We also back up the cloud metadata associated with that cluster. If it's running in the cloud, obviously, if it's running on site, there's no metadata. But that metadata is all the configuration data associated with the cluster, the type of VMs that it's running on, the node pool definitions, all the cluster configuration info, all the info that you provided to AWS or Azure when you created that cluster. And the backup, or in this case, the migration job, will capture all that data, and it gives you the option of automatically spinning up a new cluster in the cloud using that data. So when you define a backup job, or in this case, a migration or replication job, the UI will actually show you the backed up metadata associated with the cluster. And you can just accept that if you want to create a new cluster, you can go in and modify it, say use different VMs or different auto scaling configuration, different node pool configuration, whatever you want. And we back up other information associated with the cluster too, like VPC related information, separate load balancers that are associated with the cluster in the cloud. So all of that can be tied to your backup or to your migration or replication job. So the end result of that is that when you actually migrate a cluster, you can tell it, well, I want to migrate this cluster from, maybe from one AWS account to another, or one Azure region to another. And CloudCasa can actually recreate the whole cluster for you rather than you having to manually create one.
Great. Now, not to cut you off, Bob, and I just want to focus more on this. I think there's a no. This is all great information, and I think some of the folks on the line who have attended some of the previous webinars. The functionality that Bob's referring to here was our full stack recovery, right, where we're able to create a cluster on the fly. I think having those capabilities, but just for the benefit of those who haven't seen our UI yet, this from a usability perspective, we've been talking about backup and restore a lot with CloudCasa, and then I think some of the new features, Bob, that you're referring to here are just different sections here in our UI, migration and replication, right? And if I'm hearing you correctly, it encapsulates the effect of running a backup and restore in one, but it's and you're able to take advantage of these other capabilities, such as rebuilding your cluster or restoring just an individual namespace as an example.
Right. Well, with additional logic, of course, but you can think of it as somewhat like a backup and restore combined, right? So the advantage of it is that you can define a job that will, whenever you want to trigger it, do a one-shot migration of your cluster to either, say, another on-site cluster or another cloud cluster. It'll work from one cloud to another, from on-site to cloud, from cloud to on-site. There's a lot of use cases that it's great for. It can be used for things like migrating a production cluster to a new configuration, or testing the migration of a production cluster to a new configuration. Say you want to change the underlying storage configuration for your cluster. The easiest way to do that, well, the easiest way to test it out is to kind of quickly migrate it and see if it works. And then, assuming it does, you can do a full migration later.
So instead of running I'm sorry to cut you, but go ahead, Bob.
No, I was going to say you can also use it for, like I already mentioned, migrating between clouds or between cloud accounts or between cloud regions. So there's a lot of potential uses for it.
So instead of running a backup and restore, you're saying just run a migration at this point. One job defines it all, and it's kind of my one-stop shop for moving my clusters, my Kubernetes clusters around between different either clouds or on-prem, off-prem, as you mentioned. Great.
Yeah. It's also great for creating a quick dev test instance if you want to, sort of quickly clone production, maybe to a different environment or to the cloud from on site, so that you can do some testing. It's great for that too. So
Now, this is also interesting too, because in the field here, we've actually been having some discussions with uh, users of Microsoft and users using Azure Kubernetes services as their environment. One of the challenges that they're facing up against is, moving between an Ubuntu operating system that's they have their Kubernetes clusters running on to the now preferred Azure Linux operating system SKU. How does migration help with this?
Um, well, in two ways, really. First of all, for testing, if you want to migrate your AKS cluster, if you want to migrate the worker nodes from the older Linux, which is based on Ubuntu, to their newer Azure Linux release. You can do that live within your cluster by messing around with node taints and pushing jobs off your cluster and then creating another node pool with with new worker nodes that use Azure Linux as the underlying OS. But that's a lot of messing around with production that you may not really want to do, especially without testing. So, a great quick way to try that out is to just use our migration feature to kind of clone your existing production cluster to another cluster. And in the new configuration in the migration job, you can tell it to use Azure Linux for the worker nodes rather than the older OS release. That'll really just sort of magically clone your cluster. The underlying worker nodes will be running the new version of Linux, and you can test out your application, make sure that everything is cool before you go ahead and try to migrate production. And then you can use the same mechanism to migrate production, which is actually quite a bit easier than the other method of kind of swapping out node pools underneath your load.
Sounds pretty complex. We do have a question from the audience here, Bob. Kubernetes versions, do they have to be equal for cluster migration?
They do not, but generally we recommend migrating to either the same version or to a newer version.
So when we, let's say, migrate to a namespace, or let's say we migrate the entire cluster, then we can, when we do our full stack recovery where we create a new cluster on the fly, just create a cluster that has the same or greater version of Kubernetes.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, because if you're having CloudCasa create the cluster for you, you can choose the version that you want to create. If you're migrating to an existing cluster, just migrating a namespace or something, obviously it'll already be defined for you. But generally, just because of potential resource compatibility issues, we recommend either migrating to the same version or to a newer version. Going back, if you're just migrating a namespace, going back is probably fine. It really varies on a case by case basis, but for the most part, we would recommend either the existing version or a newer version.
And just to expand upon that question, because I've seen users running really earlier versions of Kubernetes, right? 1.1 something or 1.13 or 1.20. Where do you see kind of this? You say that there are to keep it at either the same or greater. Are there limitations in how far we can perform this migration to? So can we, let's say, take a 1.2.1 cluster and bring it to 1.2.9 as an example, or
Yeah,
are there limits to?
I mean, CloudCasa itself doesn't impose any limits. I mean, we support versions back to 1.19. Although I wouldn't really recommend that people run versions that old. But yeah, and it's really more an issue of what the resources we're moving, whether they're going to cause any compatibility problems, right? Like because besides moving your persistent data volumes, we're moving all the resources defined in whatever namespaces you're telling us to migrate. So with really old versions of Kubernetes, there may be compatibility problems there.
Gotcha. Like API
But
compatibility is
but
not
yeah,
able
I
to
mean,
handle.
CloudCasa will let you do it. It's just that the result may not be what you want.
Correct.
So that's why we generally recommend migrating to the same version or to a newer version.
And not to make the leap that large, right? From between versions. Let's say one
Right.
or two versions
Right.
ahead, would you say?
And as
Okay.
with anything else, if you're migrating production, I always recommend testing it first. So
Which is a great use case that you can use CloudCasa for, right?
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
um, I mean, it sounds like replication, right? We're making a copy. Migration sounds like we're making a copy as well. When would I use replication over migration or vice versa? Like, can you explain some of the
Okay.
differences in those use
Yeah.
cases?
So the main difference between a replication job and a migration job is that first of all, a replication job is scheduled. So we assume that if just to be clear, this is periodic replication, right? This is not continuous replication, uh, like block level continuous volume replication. So this is periodic replication. You can define the schedule of how often you want replication to occur. So say you want to replicate production to another cluster every hour. You can configure that. You can also configure the replication to happen on demand. So if you want some event to trigger an API call that triggers the replication, you can do that as well. Like if you know your application is going to be in a state where you want to replicate it, at some certain point, you can trigger replication at that point rather than doing it purely on a time basis. So, so one of the big differences is scheduling, right? The other difference is that replication actually replaces the target whenever the job runs. So, if you're replicating one cluster, say you want to replicate namespaces from one cluster to another cluster, the namespaces will actually be uh, destroyed and replaced on the existing cluster. I'm sorry, not on the existing cluster, on the target cluster every time the job runs. So if you're replicating, namespace Bob from cluster A to cluster B, every time the job runs, the namespace Bob on cluster B will be replaced by the latest copy from cluster A. The same thing with the entire cluster. We have the capability to replicate cloud clusters. The way we'll do that is actually by creating an entirely new cluster every time the replication job runs. So if you tell it you want to migrate the whole cloud cluster, that cluster will be newly created for every replication job run, which is assures that it's a clean, complete copy.
That's a great point. And I think, that's a very big differentiation from the current functionality today with our typical restore is that it sounds like we'll intentionally overwrite because the user would want to overwrite that data on the destination target in a replication job versus a restore job.
Right. And the benefit of doing it this way is that you don't have to deal with all of the Kubernetes resource issues when you replicate, right? Because resources are, they can depend on other resources. They can have actions associated with them if they're deleted. So this way, when we replace an entire namespace or even replace an entire cluster, you don't have to worry about those issues.
So I'd like to bring to your attention, a scenario that we've been speaking with here to some of our customers in the field that there's this concept of an edge device, let's say a fast food chain, with corporate headquarters hosting, their Kubernetes clusters in the cloud on AKS, but then they have these small fast food chain restaurants that might be running, a cluster or two. They want to keep those in sync from a data protection standpoint, right? Without, putting too much responsibility or even having these users at the if the restaurant, the food chain, even knowing about Kubernetes, how would they go about doing that using these new tools, migration and replication?
Right. Well, that's an interesting use case. What you're talking about is what I call an edge use case, right? So there's a lot of and over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of customers running Kubernetes out on the edge, in locations that are remote and not really in a traditional data center, don't necessarily have the kind of resources and support that you'd expect out in a traditional data center, right? So that the customer you just mentioned is I won't mention their name, but they're a fast food customer, and they have restaurants located all over the place, and each one of them has has Kubernetes clusters actually running there, controlling equipment and running miscellaneous applications. And applications are stateful, so there's data sitting out there at the edge. And they actually want to be able to have this hot standby cluster. So one of the great use cases for replication is to have a hot standby cluster, so that you can quickly switch from one to the other if something happens to your production cluster. And that on the edge, that's a little more complicated, because you're not necessarily guaranteed to always have the proper connectivity, and you don't really have a lot of equipment to play with out there. But one of the great use cases for this is to replicate your cluster at some kind of either on a periodic basis or on a triggered application timeline related basis, so that you always have a hot standby cluster. And in this particular edge scenario, like I said, when you're running at the edge, you're not in the traditional data center environment, right? You may have your equipment sitting somewhere, maybe it's under the fryolator or something, right? There's a lot of
Right.
potential for bad things to happen to your equipment. Maybe the fryolator boils over and you have oil all over your server. You need to be able to cut over to the backup server, to be able to maintain operations, and having that hot standby in a good state is important. And it's a little bit of an odd use case, but it's actually not all that unusual when you start talking to a lot of customers. And that's one of the great things that this new replication feature can be used for. So.
Awesome. We do have a question from the audience here, Bob. How does CloudCasa deal with migration replication of an ingress controller that usually has a fixed public IP?
Yes, so it will that's defined in the resources. So when we move the resource, it will also that IP will be moved along with it. So that may be what you want if you're running in the same network or the same VPC, that may potentially be what you want. It may also not be what you want, in which case you can use a what we call a post migration application hook, to update that resource.
So we're talking replication here, right? If I were to go and define a custom replication here, what you're saying is Let me see if I can create some to get to these other screens here. If I want to replicate continuously into Azure, I can just simply define my cluster here and then trying to get to these restore transforms here. By the way, this is, how we can go about selecting what options we want to build our cluster with, the Kubernetes version that we want to use.
Yeah,
And then, so
no,
networking type, right? This is,
yeah, normally these would be filled in. Actually, I think if in this case, if you picked Azure CNI, it would let you change the network for the target.
okay,
But if you're just talking about IP that's defined by the ingress controller configuration, that's actually a little bit different. Um,
gotcha. It doesn't look like I have any virtual networks defined that I can pull down here from, but let me just try and get to the Azure.
and-
So this is the
yeah, because you're not replicating an AKS cluster here. I think that's why it's not.
define my node pool real quick. I just want to cluster add-ons, show them the application hook section. So you're saying here in a post restore hook, run a script within your cluster to
Yeah,
handle that transaction.
yeah, that's generally what I'd recommend in that scenario. I mean, if you want to actually do that, we could have a conversation about different ways to do it, but that's probably what I would recommend.
Perfect. Okay. And then since we're already here, you had mentioned replication can be scheduled, right? So from a policy perspective, let's say I'm trying to keep my persistent volumes up to date, right? I just with something that's more centrally located, or just have that disaster recovery server failover or cluster failover option available to me. This is where I'd schedule this to run on an hourly basis or daily basis.
Right.
Perfect.
You can set up whatever interval you want here.
All right. So um, I think that's all the questions I had for you, Bob. I'm looking at some of the Q&A here. I'm not seeing any more on my end. Martin, are you seeing any more questions on your end?
Nope, I don't see any other questions. Aside from that, Bob, Martin, is there anything you like to add before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I'd just like to mention, if anyone has any more questions, obviously we'd be happy to have a discussion with you afterward. You can always contact us. Yeah, I mean, Martin has contact information here. You can also contact us through our normal support line, which is just support at cloudcasa.io. We're always, well, in particular, always happy to chat with customers about their use cases. Making sure that our software meets your particular use cases is part of my job. So I'm always, well, plus I'm always just happy to talk to customers who are using Kubernetes and doing interesting things with it. So, yeah, I mean, we're already kind of over by 5 minutes, so I don't really want to take up more of everyone's time. But as I said, if you have more questions, comments, please contact us. We'll be happy to chat with you. And Martin, if you want to kind of go over the contact information here, I guess.
Bob, Martin, if we have 1 more minute, we have a question, last minute question from Musam. Let me read it out loud. Hey, I didn't get about the replication. Can you please repeat that again?
About what part of it?
Yeah, that's quite generic question. I believe that Musam wanted to know something about the basics. However, Musam, if you could be more
Yeah,
specific about what would you like to know, please write down right now your question. But if not now, there are other options to contact both Martin and Bob. to talk with them about today's topic, and not only. As you see right now on the slide, you've got contact details to Martin. However, you can also follow both Martin and Bob on LinkedIn, which I encourage you to do that.
Yeah, if you want, I mean, we'd also be happy to set up a call if you have specific questions about replication. You can contact
Absolutely.
Martin and we'll set up a call.
So yeah, because I believe that we address a lot of different threats regarding replication and migration today. So I believe that it would be most convenient, especially to you guys, to have the most specific information that you are looking for. And I believe that our experts are available at all times. So for further information and if you want to stay updated with what's going on at CloudCasa, please also visit cloudcasa.io. And once again, contact our speakers via either email or LinkedIn, whatever you like. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, for participating in this webinar. And what can I say? Safe migrations, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.